Vera Sutton sat in the third row at her father's funeral and found out she had been written out of the will from the expression on her brother's face. Not from a lawyer, not from a formal reading in a wood-paneled office with a clock on the wall and water in a glass pitcher nobody drank from. From the specific quality of the look Raymond gave her across the aisle of the Millfield Episcopal Church on a gray Thursday morning in November. A look that contained the particular mixture of satisfaction and carefully managed sympathy that people wore when they had information they were waiting to deploy and were enjoying the waiting. Raymond was 56 years old and had been their father's business partner for 22 years and had spent most of those years building a relationship with their father that was professional and filial simultaneously in the way that suited Raymond's interests, which were considerable and which he had always pursued with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that proximity to resources was the first step toward controlling them. Vera was 53. She had lived in the same town as their father, Millfield, for her entire adult life. She had managed his household in the years after their mother died, cooking and organizing and attending the medical appointments and managing the medications and being the person who was called at 3 a.m. when something was wrong, which happened with increasing frequency in the last 2 years. She had done this because she loved her father, and because loving her father had always meant being the one who showed up, which she had done without resentment and without keeping a ledger of what it cost, because the keeping of ledgers was not how she operated. Raymond had come home for Christmas and Thanksgiving. He had called on Sundays. He had sent their father gifts that arrived in packaging from stores their father had no particular feeling for, and that Raymond had bought with the ease of a man for whom money was the primary available language of affection. He had been present for the significant events and absent for the daily ones, which was the arrangement that suited him and which he had never been asked to justify, because Vera had always been there for the daily ones, and the presence of one sibling had made the absence of the other invisible to the person who mattered. Their father, Robert Sutton, had died on a Monday morning at the age of 83. He had been failing for a year and had gone in the way he had done most things, with a minimum of drama and a maximum of stubbornness right up to the end. Vera had been with him. She had been with him for the 3 days before the end as well, sleeping in the chair beside the hospital bed with her coat as a blanket, because the chair was a hospital chair and the available comfort was the coat. Raymond had arrived Tuesday morning. He had arrived with his wife Linda, who was polished in the specific way of people who understood that appearance was a form of communication, and with the composed authority of someone who had been in contact with the family lawyers and was in possession of information that other people in the room were not. The funeral was Thursday. The look across the aisle was Thursday. The formal reading was Friday morning in the offices of Sutton and Marsh, which was her father's firm and which bore his name, in the wood-paneled office with the clock on the wall and the water in the glass pitcher that nobody drank from. The will left the firm and its assets to Raymond, with the explanation in the accompanying letter that Robert Sutton had believed Raymond's professional involvement made him the appropriate custodian of the business that bore the family name. It left the house, the family home on Carver Street, where Vera had grown up and where she had been managing her father's life for 7 years, to Raymond as well, with a similar letter explanation about keeping family property consolidated. It left Vera the cabin. The lawyer, whose name was Gerald Marsh, and who was the Marsh of Sutton and Marsh, and who had known Vera since she was a child, read the cabin bequest with a careful neutrality that suggested he was aware of how it would land, and had decided that neutrality was the professional response. He said that the property on Lake Road, the cabin, was bequeathed to Vera Ann Sutton in its entirety, along with whatever it contained. Raymond said nothing. Linda looked at the window. Vera looked at Gerald Marsh and asked if there was anything else. He said there was a letter, separate from the will, which was addressed to her and which he was instructed to give her privately. She said she would collect it later. She stood up and thanked Gerald Marsh and left the office. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes. She thought about her father, not the man whose will had just been read, not the man whose decisions she would not understand for some time yet, but the man who had taught her to fish at the lake cabin when she was 7, and who had called her his practical one since she was 12, and who had held her hand at her mother's funeral and at the end of the 3rd day in the hospital chair, and who had been, for all of his complexity and all of the ways his choices had been shaped by dynamics she had understood imperfectly, a man she had loved completely. She did not cry. She thought about crying, and then she started the car and drove to Millfield Hardware and bought a padlock and 2 boxes of heavy-duty trash bags, because she had decided in the parking lot of Sutton and Marsh that what she was going to do was go to the cabin and see whatever it contained actually was. She had not been to the cabin in 11 years. The Lake Road cabin was 35 minutes from Millfield, a drive that took her out of town and through the kind of landscape that existed between places, the farmland and the second-growth forest, and the occasional cluster of mailboxes at the end of unmarked drives. The lake appeared on the right side of the road, 12 minutes from the cabin, visible in sections through the trees, gray and flat in November light. The cabin was at the end of a track that left Lake Road at a gap in the tree line, marked by a post that had once had a reflector on it and no longer did. The track was unpaved and showed the specific deterioration of something that had not been regularly used, the grass growing down the center between the tire tracks and the tree branches encroaching from both sides. She parked where the track widened near the cabin door. The cabin was smaller than her childhood memory of it, which was the way places from childhood were always recalibrated by adult scale. Single-story, timber construction, a covered porch along the front with 2 old wooden chairs that had weathered to the particular silver gray of outdoor furniture left to the seasons for many years. The roof had moss along its north-facing edge. The window shutters were closed and latched from the outside. The key she had found on her father's household key ring, the spare that he had kept in the kitchen drawer at Carver Street since before she could remember, fit the front door lock without difficulty. She went inside. The cabin smelled of closure, the particular compound of sealed air and old wood and cold ash from the fireplace that unoccupied cabins developed when they had been shut against the world for a long time and not asked to be anything else. The main room was furnished with the furniture she remembered from childhood, nothing replaced and nothing removed. a sofa with cushions that had faded from a green she remembered as vivid to something quieter, a table with 4 chairs, bookshelves on either side of the fireplace, still full, a kitchen area along the back wall, with the particular orderly state of a kitchen last used by someone who washed up and put everything away before they left. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. She had expected neglect. She had expected the specific damage of 11 years of vacancy, the damp and the deterioration, and the evidence of the small animals that moved into empty spaces when humans vacated them. The cabin had some of this in the corners and along the north wall nearest the lake, but less than she had expected. Her father had been here more recently than 11 years. Someone had been here more recently than that. She went to the bookshelves. Her father had been a reader. She had known this in the general sense of knowing things about a parent. The presence of books in the house on Carver Street, the reading glasses on the bedside table. She had not fully known it in the specific sense until she stood in front of these shelves and read the spines and understood from the density and range of what was there that this had been the room where he had read the way he actually wanted to read, rather than the way a man in a house with other people in it read. There were notebooks on the lower shelf. Not books, notebooks, the composition variety. A row of them with dates written on their spines in her father's handwriting. 31 of them, spanning from a date 14 years ago to a date 8 months before his death. She pulled the earliest one. She read the first page, standing in front of the shelf. Then she sat down on the faded sofa and read for an hour. Her father had been writing. Not a diary, not a memoir in the conventional sense, something that was its own category, the organized thinking of a man who had been working through something for 14 years and had been using the cabin and the notebooks as the place and the instrument of that working through. The writing was precise and reflective and had the quality of a mind she recognized, the specific way her father had organized his thoughts when he was being serious rather than performing seriousness. He had been writing about the firm, about what he had built, and what he had come to understand about what he had built, including the parts he had not been proud of. About Raymond, with a clarity that was more honest than anything he had said to Vera in his lifetime about her brother, the specific ways in which Raymond's relationship with the firm had been one of acquisition rather than stewardship, the decisions that had been made in the name of business that her father had agreed to and come to regret. About Vera, in terms that she read twice and then sat down and looked at the window for a long time. He had written about her with the specific guilt of a man who understood what he had done and had not been able to undo it while he was alive. He had written about the 7 years she had spent managing his life and what that had cost her, and what he had failed to acknowledge while she was doing it. He had written about the will, which he described as a decision that had been made under pressure of a kind he documented in specific detail. A pressure that was financial and relational, and that Raymond had applied over years with the patient consistency of a man who understood how to shape decisions without appearing to make them. He had written about the cabin. The final notebook, the one dated 8 months before his death, was different from the others, less reflective and more specific, the writing of a man who understood he was running out of time and was moving from processing to record. He had written about the cabin's contents, not the furniture or the books or the 31 notebooks, the contents of the space beneath the cabin, which she had not yet found, which was not a basement in the conventional sense, but a dry storage space that he had constructed himself 20 years ago by excavating a section beneath the main room and fitting it with a proper floor and sealed walls and a hatch in the floor of the closet at the back of the main room. She put the notebook down and went to the closet. The hatch was under a wool rug that had been rolled to one side in a way that suggested it had been rolled and replaced many times. The hatch itself was fitted timber with a recessed handle set flush with the floor and essentially invisible unless you knew it was there or were looking for it with the specific attention she was now bringing to it. She lifted it. Below was a wooden ladder, and below the ladder was the space her father had described in the final notebook. She found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer where her father had always kept it, which was where it still was, the batteries replaced at some point in the recent past, because the light was strong and immediate when she clicked it. She went down the ladder. The storage space was approximately the size of the main room above it, dry in the way her father's writing had described, sealed against moisture with a thoroughness that had been maintained over years. Shelves along 3 walls, fitted with the same precision as the bookshelves upstairs, because the same hands had built them. On the shelves were boxes, document boxes, labeled in her father's handwriting, and between the boxes, wrapped in protective cloth and fitted cases of varying sizes, objects that she began to uncover and examine with the flashlight and the growing understanding of what she was looking at. Her father had been collecting, not in the random way of a person who picked things up because they were charming or because they had sentimental value, in the deliberate and knowledgeable way of a person who understood what they were looking at and had been looking for specific things over a long period of time. The document boxes contained records, acquisition records going back 30 years, before the cabin storage space existed, predating even the notebooks. Provenance documentation for each item, assembled with a thoroughness that reflected either professional guidance or self-education of a serious kind. And she suspected both, because the final notebook mentioned a correspondence with an appraiser in the city that had begun 20 years ago and continued until 2 years before his death. The objects on the shelves were American folk art and craft, spanning from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th. Quilts in archival storage, painted furniture in cases, carved figures in fitted boxes with the documentation of their origin and maker filed beside them. A collection of hand-forged ironwork from a tradition she recognized from her father's home region, the same hills outside Millfield where his own grandfather had been a blacksmith, documented and attributed with the care of a man who understood what he was preserving and why. She sat on the floor of the storage space with the flashlight and the final notebook and read what her father had written about the collection. He had assembled it over 30 years with the specific intention described in the notebook's final pages. He had not told Raymond because Raymond had never shown any interest in the cabin or in his father's reading or in the things his father cared about that were not the firm and its assets. He had not told Vera because he had been waiting until the time was right, and the time had not been right until now, until the moment when Vera came to the cabin alone with a key and found the hatch. He had written that the collection, based on the most recent appraisal conducted 4 years before his death, was worth significantly more than what the will had assigned to Raymond. He had written that this was the intention. He had written that leaving the cabin to Vera, with whatever it contained, was the only thing he had been able to do that Raymond could not influence, because Raymond did not know the collection existed, and because the will's language was simple and its meaning was clear, and whatever the cabin contained was Vera's. He had written that he was sorry he had not been braver earlier. He had written that he was sorry for the chair beside the hospital bed, and the 3 days, and the coat as a blanket, and all of the years before that. He had written that she had always been the practical one, and that he had trusted her with the thing that required the most practicality, because he knew she would know what to do with it. She sat with the notebook in the dry, sealed room beneath the cabin for a long time. The flashlight held steady. Above her, the cabin held its closed quiet. The sofa and the table and the bookshelves and the 31 notebooks and the faded cushions and the fireplace that needed cleaning before it could be used. Outside, the lake was gray and flat in November light, the same lake it had been when she was 7, and her father had taught her to fish from the dock that still extended into the water at the edge of the property, weathered to silver gray now, like the chairs on the porch, still standing. She had been humiliated in a church on Thursday. She had sat in the wood-paneled office on Friday and heard her brother receive the firm and the house and the consolidated family assets, while she received a cabin on Lake Road with whatever it contained. Raymond had looked at her with the expression of a man who believed he had won something. She thought about that expression. Then she thought about 30 years of her father's careful, knowledgeable, completely private work, sitting on shelves in the dry, sealed room beneath her feet, waiting for the person he had trusted to find it and know what to do. She thought about the lawyer's letter she had not yet collected, still in Gerald Marsh's office, addressed to her privately. She thought about the appraiser whose correspondence was documented in the records boxes, the name she had noted because she intended to call it. She thought about Raymond, who had been in proximity to the resources for 22 years and had understood the firm and the house and the assets that were visible, and had not understood his father at all. She stood up. She went up the ladder. She went to the kitchen and filled the kettle and put it on the gas burner, which caught on the second attempt because the cabin had been closed and the pilot needed time. She took the final notebook to the table and sat down and opened it to the page where her father had written the appraiser's name and number and the most recent figure that had been discussed between them 4 years before his death. She looked at the figure for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. She had a call to make and a letter to collect, and a great deal of work ahead of her that she was entirely equipped for, because she had always been the practical one, and her father had known it, and had built something in the one place that remained hers, and had waited, with the specific patience of a man who had run out of braver options, but had not run out of love, for her to find it. The kettle began to heat. Outside, the lake was still. Vera made her call.